Right, it's that time where we cross over to our Ocean for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important development in world affairs.
Thank you, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, governments around the world have expressed concern that freedom is no more in Hong Kong. A legislative council election took place over the weekend with 90% of the seats awarded to pro-China candidates. Only 30% of Hong Kong's 4.2 million voters had gone to the polls, and many observers say that the election was widely boycotted by the people who lost faith in the electoral system and the region's governance after relentless crackdowns by Beijing and local authorities, which imposed a repressive national security law on the people of Hong Kong. Now, under the Sino-British Agreement, Hong Kong is promised certain democratic freedoms as a semi-autonomous region separate from mainland China until the year 2047. But is the one country, two systems now effectively dead? Joining us to discuss the future of Hong Kong and what it means for the people is Nachman, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Harvard University Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, and Eric Lei, Hong Kong Law Fellow at Georgetown Center for Asian Law. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. And, well, let's start with you, Mr. Nachman. Now, Beijing has blamed the pandemic and what it called anti-China elements for the low voter turnout of around 30.2%. But many reports say that citizens were actually out and about in Hong Kong, but just not in polling stations. What did you make of the turnout that day?
With turnout so low, this really shows that Hong Kongers no longer see their electoral system as meaningful or something worth participating in. When the government puts on these mass campaigns to promote people to vote, they had free public transportation, there were campaigns all around the city encouraging people to vote, and people were most certainly out and about. They took advantage of the free public transportation, but no one was going to vote. And I really think this shows that Hong Kongers really see a qualitative difference in their political institutions now that there's been these big reforms and changes into who is allowed to run and just how much of a pro-Beijing slant every electoral position now has to have.
Mr. Lei, how did you see this election? I mean, even if there had been a higher turnout, do you think the results would have looked more or less the same?
The result would be more or less the same, given the fact that this new electoral system prohibits any meaningful opposition to participate in the campaign and in the elections. And let us not to forget that there should have been more than 47 opposition candidates running for these elections, but now they are all in jail under the national security law imposed last year. And this new electoral system not only prohibits them to run for elections, but prohibits anyone who are genuine opposition, because all the candidates are now filtered by a new review committee that they will decide who can run for elections based on the investigation of National Security Police in Hong Kong.
And well, Mr. Nachman, now 90% of the seats, they've been taken over by pro-Beijing candidates, and they've expressed excitement or eagerness to get to work and talk about issues that need to be addressed in the city. But can we expect any genuine discourse and deliberation to take place in this new legislature, or is it now simply a smaller model of China's rubber stamp parliament?
Like Eric pointed out, any meaningful opposition who wanted to run in these elections have either been jailed or have been silenced completely. And the result is that every elected official in Hong Kong now is going to completely toe the pro-Beijing line. No one is going to be able to offer any sort of meaningful dissent or any sort of opposing opinion from Beijing. And in fact, it would arguably be dangerous for them to do so. And unfortunately, what that means is that Hong Kong's Legislative Council is largely going to be just another repeating talking point for Beijing. A lot of the same messages are going to be coming across from both outlets now.
And Mr. Lei, Beijing's talked about how Hong Kong has a democracy with Hong Kong characteristics. I mean, what does it mean by that?
It only means that China does not want Hong Kong to have a full democracy under the international human rights law framework. We have the basic law in Hong Kong that promised the people in Hong Kong to have universal suffrage with free and fair elections. And in Hong Kong, the Basic Law also guarantees the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights be implemented in Hong Kong. But now, with the new propaganda of Hong Kong's democracy with Hong Kong characteristics, it only means that they want to bring Hong Kong into a system like in the mainland China. And lots of the propaganda now we can see by the Chinese authorities are mainly targeting its people in the mainland to say Hong Kong still have democracy. But if you ask people in Hong Kong, they will tell you generally that they don't buy this take.
And Mr. Lei, since 2019, the people of Hong Kong have expressed what they would like in a democracy. They staged huge protests, and it was inspiring for the world to see. But how did Beijing manage to neutralize these kind of efforts?
Beijing made good use of its power to introduce a new national security law with new institutions of national security police in Hong Kong to investigate, arrest, and prosecute people who merely made peaceful anti-government speeches, showing slogans, or even to organize or to participate in peaceful voting in civil society, saying them are criminals that endanger national security in Hong Kong and China. And this is quite worrying because now, after almost 1.5 years of the imposition of the national security law, we have more than 150 citizens being arrested, and now more than half of them are facing trial in the coming years, and they can be sentenced to a life jail in the future. And this has been creating a chilling effect in society that whatever you are peaceful or militant protesters, whatever you are academics, you are lawyers, or you are simply medical workers, if you do not show obedience to Beijing, if you do not show your loyalty to Beijing publicly, you can be seen as the enemy of the state, and you could have legal consequences in the future.
And Mr. Nachman, well, in recent months, of course, as Ms. Lei just mentioned, there have been massive crackdowns on medical workers, lawyers, just citizens, journalists, activists after Hong Kong authorities adopted the national security law. And this stipulates heavy legal penalties for very loosely defined acts of secession, subversion, terrorism and collusion with foreign organisations. And it also criminalises any speech, online and written, that calls for Hong Kong secession from China. But Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, she's trying to push through now Article 23 for the Basic Law, which allows Hong Kong authorities to punish dissidents on its own. Why does Beijing want to pursue this when the Security Act that it wanted to enforce, it's already done enough to really suppress the freedom of expression?
So Article 23 actually has a long history in Hong Kong. Back in 2003, it was the cause of mass protest against the addition to the Basic Law, because Hong Kongers do not want this type of mass punishment laws written into the Basic Law. Now, a lot of the stipulations under national security law already exist, but what Article 23 would do would essentially cement many of these features into Hong Kong's Basic Law, which serves as its sort of mini constitution. Currently, the national security law is part of the annex section of the Basic Law, and by adding Article 23, it would really kind of implement it to an even deeper level by further defining what would be punishable and why. Essentially, Beijing wants to be able to really institutionalize this crackdown into as many legal channels as it possibly can, and by adding Article 23, it would essentially be a point of no return for any sort of dissent in Hong Kong.
Mr. Lai, well, Hong Kong's semi-autonomous status, it was supposed to expire in 2047, and many believed that the unfortunate reality would be Beijing moving to absorb it. But it looks like that future might already be here. What plans do you think Beijing has for Hong Kong?
I think Beijing still want to keep Hong Kong as a facade, a mask of a one country, two system, to continue to attract foreign investment and business people to continue to invest in Hong Kong and see Hong Kong as a good business hub for both China and for the West's sake. But the reality is that given the new national security law and given there are multiple crackdowns on Hong Kong civil society by the governments, that the international community would no longer believe that Hong Kong still enjoy a one country, two systems that China had promised it as early as 1980s. And with the new white paper on Hong Kong's democracy that was issued by Beijing yesterday, we can see China is assertive to bring Hong Kong into one country, one system, to converge Hong Kong into part of the mainland system very soon.
And Mr. Nachman, do you think there's any hope of international pressure working or any room for negotiation? I mean, sanctions on high-level officials seem to have failed so far. Do you think there's just no going back now for the Chinese government?
It's extremely difficult to put pressure on a system when so many of these legal definitions through national security law are already implemented into Hong Kong's law. Even though there's been a lot of pushback from governments around the world, really what governments are trying to do more right now is really provide a safe haven for Hong Kongers who are fleeing Hong Kong, either pro-democracy politicians or activists from the 2019 movement. Unfortunately, whether or not sanctions will be effective, we know that sanctions tend not to be particularly strong tools for trying to push back laws like this. But I think at the very least, the kind of symbolic effort that countries are doing to push back against the PRC and advocacy for Hong Kong is still a cause worth pursuing.
And Mr. Nachman, why do you think that, well, if Beijing was going to absorb Hong Kong anyway in 2047, why do you think the Xi Jinping regime is moving to do this right now at this point?
You know, given the context of 2019, just a couple of years ago, we saw voter turnout over 70%. And it was largely in favor of pro-democracy, pro-movement politicians who were running for local representation. And from the PRC's perspective, the entire 2019 social protest really was a sign that there was potentially something in Hong Kong that was going in a direction that it could maybe no longer control. And from the PRC's perspective, hastening the timeline or pushing the timeline forward would be the path of least resistance for them. And it would lead to the massive crackdown and harsh repression in Hong Kong. But at the very least, it eliminates this kind of opposition from ever properly growing or ever having the chance to grow in Hong Kong. Essentially, by moving the timeline forward, Xi Jinping and the PRC have been able to make Hong Kong part of its one country, one system much faster and without any sort of need for formal discussion from Hong Kongers.
I would say, do you think international pressure is going to work? Do you think there's anything that the global community can do?
I think it is important that Hong Kong shall be kept on the agenda of the international community. And there are so many opportunities and spaces for our members of the international community to emphasize on the human rights protections in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong is also part of the international human rights regime. And given that there are so many people in Hong Kong, they are leaving the city to be exiled or to relocate for safety reasons, there are so many rooms for international communities and for the global communities to support these people as migrants or as refugees, and to give them a life with dignity wherever they are.
That was Lev Nachman and Eric Lay joining us today from Boston and Washington, D.C. Thank you both so much for your time.